From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Mission accomplished. That was the message Alberta Premier Jason Kenney sent in late May when he told Albertans that 2021 would be the best summer ever.
Today we are announcing Alberta's Open for Summer plan. This is Alberta's three-stage plan to lift all public health restrictions and finally get our lives back to normal just in time for summer.
Now, with the highest rate of COVID death in Canada, here's Kenney in September.
It is now clear that we were wrong, and for that, I apologize.
Alberta is a COVID hotbed in this fourth wave. It has the most active cases, new daily cases, and deaths over the last 2 weeks. The Canadian Armed Forces, Red Cross, and healthcare workers from other provinces are being flown in to help. Alberta's own patients are being flown elsewhere because their ICUs are bursting. Then there's Saskatchewan, right next door, where record highs of cases and hospitalizations were set throughout September. After a hot start when vaccines were first released, Saskatchewan's vaccination rate has stalled and is now the lowest of all provinces. On This Matters, Kieran Leavitt, Alberta politics reporter for the Toronto Star, who joins us from Edmonton. How did Western Canada end up in this mess again? What decisions plunged Alberta and Saskatchewan into this crisis? And can they push the fourth wave down? Kieran, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Adrian. It's good to be back.
Alberta and Saskatchewan are in a dire situation right now. Alberta particularly is the COVID capital of the country. It's broken records in essentially every metric: ICU capacity, hospitalizations, deaths, especially heading into this fall. Can you give us a sense of what the mood is like in the province right now?
Yeah, it's hard to put into words. I think the mood is a mixture of feelings, obviously. I mean, it's a dire situation. There's no other way to put it. And I think there's a lot of frustration from people on all sides of this problem that we're facing. You've got folks in Alberta who are really upset about public health restrictions and vaccine mandates and vaccine passports, things of that nature. And then you've got people who are just really upset with the fact that it's got so bad and that there's been a feeling that the government has sort of dragged their feet through this thing. So that's, resulted in frustration and anger as well. But I think there's generally underpinning a lot of it is this feeling of sadness and a bit of heartbreak for frontline healthcare workers who are just struggling to keep up with the caseload right now. And the amount of deaths as well, are going up and up. And it's just a heartbreaking thing when you really sort of take stock of all the people's family members and loved ones who are struggling in hospitals or who are passing.
Mm-hmm. There's, of course, a real human cost to this. Looking at the numbers, they're staggering. Health Canada's data shows that since August 1st, people in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they are dying at 4 times the rate as the rest of Canada. How did it get this bad? What kinds of policy decisions were made that led to this?
You can go back to early July. The decision was made in Alberta first to essentially reopen. And about 10 days later, Saskatchewan did the same thing. From a lot of public health experts and epidemiologists and doctors that I've spoken to and that are very vocal on social media and vocal in traditional media, that decision was too much too soon. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people say that to me. And it's not that they were saying that in hindsight, that was said at the time as well. And so you've heard this acknowledged as well to a certain degree by Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health saying, we really had quote unquote endemic insight and really thought that this was going to be the winding down. And they were wrong. There's really no other way to put it. They were wrong and their messaging was wrong. Jason Kenney was out flipping pancakes at the Calgary Stampede.
Stampede is all about community. And after the past 16 months, it is so great that we are able to reconnect as community, coming together. I call it the best summer ever just because we can see the smiles again.
Coincidentally, ostensibly, maybe that happened right after public health restrictions were, for all intents and purposes, lifted in Alberta.
And we're talking basically like no masking mandates, no vaccination mandates, none of those things.
That's right. None of those things. Everything, if you are living your life and you're not a, worker in a long-term care home or something like that, you didn't have any restrictions. The nightclubs were allowed to reopen, no masking, restaurants were packed. And I can just tell you, I lived downtown in Edmonton. I still live close by, and it was basically back to normal. So that happened, and summer clipped along, and Jason Kenney and his government basically took their hands off of the steering wheel. Jason Kenney went on vacation in early August, and we saw cases start to just skyrocket in August, but we didn't hear anything from anybody in government. Jason Kenney was somewhere, he wasn't around. There was nobody left in charge. There wasn't like some designated minister that was coming out every day and saying, hey, we see that there's, hundreds of new cases and more hospitalizations, and we're doing X, Y, and Z to manage that. That didn't happen for weeks and weeks. Even the chief medical officer of health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, she was not around in that mid-August time period. So it was a bit of a rudderless ship in a lot of ways at that point. And then eventually Jason Kenney did come back, and his ministers did start coming out and talking to the public and addressing that this was even happening, that the COVID situation was untenable. But then, it was a lot of resisting ideas from the public health sector, not necessarily in government, but outside of government, about things like vaccine passports and public health measures. And they didn't want to bring those things in. And then, of course, famously reversed that decision in early September when it became, obvious that this was the way to go.
To what extent, I wonder too, is there anger? Because early in the summer, again, at this point it's probably infamous, but Jason Kenney said Alberta is open for summer. They were selling caps that said best summer ever, Alberta 2021. And that just looks morose now, doesn't it? I mean, when you look at what's actually transpiring, how angry are people feeling?
Extremely angry. There's a dictionary of expletives I could probably use to just describe how the anger is visceral. And, in terms of political messaging, and I think it's totally fair to say at this point that Jason Kenney really painted himself into a corner with all of that, right? Like you mentioned the hats, you mentioned the slogans, open for summer, open for good, back for business, never bringing in restrictions again. His staffers are on Twitter talking about how the pandemic is over. They're selling baseball hats online, the United Conservative Party, that say best summer ever. And, if they were right, that might have played well for them, but they were very, very, very wrong. And, that is just the kind of messaging that now people are just slapping them around with on social media and in the media. It's a running joke, and it worked out terribly for them. And so the anger is absolutely, people are fuming mad, because people are really affected by this, and not just in terms of folks dying or restrictions or that kind of thing, but thousands of surgeries have been postponed. And I just know from having a friend group in Alberta, I know several people who are directly impacted by all of this. And so it really is hitting home for a lot of people. And it's really easy to draw the line for folks who follow what's going on. And I mean, in COVID times, who doesn't? It's really easy to just look at the government and be like, well, you totally messed this up, and your messaging was totally wrong. And you lied to me, or you misled me. And so, that feeling is, it's very front and center right now in Alberta.
So in Alberta, what are the restrictions and measures at this point? Because Kenney has declared an emergency here. So what are they doing right at this moment?
Alberta has a opt-in vaccine passport system, which Jason Kenney rather infamously called the restriction exemption program, which one could argue is, maybe a slightly more accurate turn of phrase for what it actually is. But all the same, people see it as a vaccine passport. So you can download your vaccine status, and then businesses, non-essential businesses like nightclubs, restaurants, bars, sporting events, certain other kinds of organized events that are considered non-essential, can opt in for this vaccine passport. And if they do that, if they require people to show their vaccination status before entry, then those facilities can be exempt from the public health restrictions. And those public health restrictions are things like capacity and spacing restrictions. There is still a mask mandate that was brought back. So Alberta didn't have a mask mandate all summer, and then in September brought back masks. So that's still here as well. But outside of that, that's about it.
We'll be right back. I wanted to touch on Saskatchewan as well, which we've seen similar kinds of provincial responses, similar outcomes, I suppose, when it comes to COVID. Premier Scott Moe said he was steadfastly against vax passports. He called it divisive. Then mid-September, he changed course. Masking mandates, much like Alberta, were back in. Vaccine passport system with QR codes are in as of October 1st.
If you are unvaccinated and living in Saskatchewan, it's now time to get your shot. The vast majority of Saskatchewan people that have done the right thing, quite frankly, they are tired of those that have chose not to.
So is it fair to say that Saskatchewan actually hews pretty closely to Alberta in terms of the COVID situation? Maybe not in terms of pure raw numbers, but the outcomes at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that they're very much the same because they've followed similar policy decisions and similar messaging. They're very ideologically aligned in a lot of ways, the two governments, and they mirror each other, I think, with political cultures as well. You've got a fairly significant rural-urban divide in both provinces, strong sort of prairie populist streaks amongst the voters. And so all of those things play or have played into the COVID situation. And Scott Moe similarly criticized for opening up early in July and sort of trying to put the pandemic behind him before it was really time to do that. And so, yeah, similar thing, didn't want to bring in more public health restrictions, didn't want to bring in vaccine passports. I interviewed a doctor in Saskatchewan last week who talked about how, they reversed course on the vaccine passport system in mid-September, but what would have happened if they had just started working on their vaccine passport in mid-summer and had it ready to roll out in September? You can play all these what if games as long as you want, but it's hard to avoid doing that when you take stock of how many people were telling the government at that time that what they were doing was wrong.
Right. This isn't something in hindsight where you can Monday morning quarterback and say, we got that thing wrong. Public health experts at the time in both of these provinces had said this is too much too soon, right?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. Going back to Alberta, you talked about Jason Kenney's decisions around COVID, and of course they have been panned even at a national level, right? Conservative Party leader Erin O'Toole distanced themselves from him. Is Kenney fighting for political survival here, even within Alberta?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jason Kenney's political future is very much in question. And the situation here is different than in Saskatchewan in that sense, because Scott Moe leads a very united caucus, whereas Jason Kenney's caucus is extremely divided and his own party is divided. And it's divided along the lines very much, I think, in the same way that some Albertans are divided as well. You've got your members of the legislature in Alberta who are from rural constituencies, and they're really upset over the imposition of a vaccine passport system and the reimposition of more public health restrictions after Jason Kenney spent the summer running around Alberta and talking about how we're open forever and we're never going to go back to lockdowns. And he said repeatedly, we'll never have a vaccine passport in this province. And it's tough for those MLAs because they represent these rural ridings and they go into their constituencies, and these representatives will go into the A&W in a small hamlet of 100 people and sit down for a coffee, and their constituents will say, hey, you promised us that we're never going to have any restrictions ever again and that we're open forever and open for good. And now Jason Kenney's talking about a vaccine passport and he's talking about public health restrictions. Like, what's going on? And these MLAs are kind of sat with an egg on their face. And so there's a lot of anger amongst these rural MLAs because a lot of their constituency members just don't want any public health restrictions, don't want vaccine passports. It's no secret that most of the vaccine hesitancy and low uptake is in rural areas in Alberta. There's a lot of populist sentiments out there and a bit of a libertarian streak as well, where they don't really want government telling them how to live their lives.
Yeah, these are deeply and historically conservative, hands-off places.
Yeah. And so those MLAs are upset. Those MLAs are upset with the leadership. They're upset with Jason Kenney's communicative style on all of this, obviously with the flip-flopping. And they've had it about up to here and they're ready to see him gone. There was almost a non-confidence vote brought up within the last couple of weeks at a caucus meeting. And within his party, the vice president of policy for the United Conservative Party, which I should mention is a conservative party in Alberta that Jason Kenney founded himself in 2017. He united two conservative parties here. And the vice president said he wanted Kenney to resign. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of MLAs and members of his caucus that are really upset with him dragging his feet through August when there were cases skyrocketing and things were really bad. The health minister, I was told by a source, was ready to resign because of this whole situation. So it's trouble in paradise on all sides for Jason Kenney. And it was looking sketchy there for him for a couple weeks, but it now looks as though what will happen is a leadership review in 2022 in April. And at that point, we may see not enough support for Jason Kenney's leadership, and they may try and get him out before the 2023 election when, the NDP and Rachel Notley, if you look at the polls, are looking really strong for.
Mm-hmm. So there's two sides essentially that are upset at him. People who said that he dragged his feet, that he, loosened restrictions too quickly. And then the other side said, you went back on your word. So he's really pleasing very few people right now within his own caucus.
Exactly. And I think that's mirrored in the public as well. You've got those same sort of divisions where it's this, sort of running joke among political circles that Jason Kenney is the only politician who is able to anger both sides of the political spectrum at the same time for making one decision. And it's shocking. I mean, I've covered Jason Kenney since 2018, consistently. And I mean, his reputation, you got to remember, he's a lifelong politician and he was Stephen Harper's right-hand man for many years. He was an immigration minister, national defense minister, federally, just a veteran of parliamentary politics. And he came to Alberta with this cachet and this reputation of being a political mastermind. And he wielded the kind of respect and the kind of reverence that you don't see very often in politics. And he had this kind of aura around him where, he was just an impressive guy. And now it's like how far he's fallen it's staggering. I could not have predicted it. And I think a lot of political watchers in Alberta couldn't have predicted it. I don't think they could have predicted that Rachel Notley's NDP would be so favorable at this point either. So yeah, Alberta's a funny place. It's really, really interesting politically. I know Alberta's got this reputation of being this kind of conservative stronghold and nothing really changes much here. But there's an undercurrent there that I think is very populist and very engaged and very willing to toss people out when they are feeling as though those people are not doing a good job for them.
Right. Alberta voters famously, of course, tossed the Conservative Party out and went NDP for the first time in, 2 generations? So it has been done before, even just in recent history.
For sure. And I think the UCP came in after that period of 4 years with the NDP thinking things are now right in the universe and the pieces have fallen back into place as they should be. From people that I talked to in those circles, I think they underestimated Alberta voters and the shifting of the demographics in this province to a place where they're ready to sort of, they've had a taste of that. They've had a taste of flipping a government and getting somebody new in and saying, look, we're not going to put up with whatever you're throwing at us anymore. We can vote you out. And so there's this very sort of, tenuous feeling, I think, for the UCP right now. And that's playing into this angling to get Jason Kenney potentially thrown out before the next provincial election.
Kieran, I know we are wading into some deep waters here by even bringing this up, but anytime you talk federalism and Western Canada and Western Canadian politics in the same sentence, there's bound to be people who have very strong thoughts about that. But at this stage, as it relates to the pandemic, are there calls for the federal government to step in? And can they step in even if they wanted to?
There are, and there have been. I know there's been talks between the federal government and the provincial government through this whole thing. And recently, we've seen some of the ministers on both ends from federal and provincial talking more and more about what help would actually look like. Jason Kenney announced that he would be working to get some members of the Canadian Armed Forces into Alberta to help relieve some of the pressure on ICUs. which have been operating anywhere from 83 to 90% capacity, and in some places at 100% capacity, especially in the north. So Canadian Armed Forces members will hopefully be coming to help. Canadian Red Cross, I believe, is looking to send around 20 staff. And then Newfoundland and Labrador have also offered to send some trained healthcare workers as well. So I think all in all, the estimate was about 35 people. And really, at the end of the day, that's only about 5 or 6 ICU spaces. And that'll add on top of the already, 370 odd ICU beds that we already have. So there is help. And, politically, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, people know about Alberta and Ottawa butting heads on everything from equalization to pipelines to the carbon tax, literally fighting each other in court. And Jason Kenney never, ever shying away from taking a shot at Justin Trudeau. So, yeah, there's sort of an irony in all of it as well.
Kieran, it's great to talk to you. Thank you for your reporting and for being here.
Thanks, Adrian. It was really good to chat with you too.
And that is Kieran Leavitt, Alberta politics reporter for the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Pattinen. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattinen. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.